You are listening to the Enormocast.
So what's your tired excuse for not wearing a helmet? Too heavy? Not anymore. Too hot? You literally wear a beanie in your sweltering climbing gym, bro. Too dumb looking? Well, you might have me there. But you know what else is dumb looking? Brain damage. Yes, 25 years ago, all those excuses might have had legs. But Black Diamond's modern helmets shut them all down. The new redesigned Half Dome is durable, lightweight, lower profile, and sports an improved chin strap and better headlamp clips. It's just a great modern climbing helmet. And it comes at a price point 0.1% of your average ER visit. But listen, we here at the Enormocast really just want you to consider getting your freaking brain wrapped in a helmet. And while we'd love for you to support Black Diamond, end up in a Half Dome, or the racier Vector or Vapor, frankly, there's a lot of great lightweight helmets out there, and it's time to reconsider your prejudices for the old brain bucket. So support the Enormocast by checking out Black Diamond's redesigned Half Dome and all their helmets at blackdiamondequipment.com or your favorite local shop. But if you don't find what you like there, look around and get your brain behind some foam and plastic before it's too late.
Does your partner suffer from try-it-again syndrome? Or one-hangitis? Or even worse, delusional performance disorder? Well, there really isn't a cure for DPD, except for a good smackdown. But it does probably mean that you've been belaying them for hours and hours on end, and are now suffering from BNP, or belay or neck pain, a stiffness in the cervical spine just below the occipital region of your thick skull. But now there's a cure for BNP resulting from DPD. Ask your doctor about belay specs, and when he doesn't know what the hell you're talking about, just smile and tuck that prescription for opiates away for your next overseas plane flight. But then ask several strangers about belay specs. Ask that cute barista at the coffee shop on the corner about belay specs. In fact, ask everyone you know about belay specs. Keep talking about belay specs until nobody wants to climb with you anyway. Problem solved. But if that doesn't work, then go to belayspecs.com and get yourself a pair. And don't forget to enter Enormocast at checkout for a discount and to help out the podcast. Side effects may include people thinking you're staring at them when you're not, old trad climbers rolling their eyes, people putting them on for the first time and saying, "Ooh, that's trippy," people insisting they don't like those weird glasses even though they've never even tried them. If you feel drowsy, nauseous, rumbling in your stomach, horny, confused, or have strange, vivid dreams, this probably has nothing to do with belay specs. It is more likely from that bug you picked up in that backpacker's hostel in Rio after 5 too many caipirinhas. Belayspecs.com. Say adios to belay or neck pain.
Listen, where are you playing in town? Are you playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
a
the big place, that side of town. That's a big
nice
place. You sold it out. 20,000 seats.
You really should.
Look, you better get up there before you panic. Those pens are loose. You're very good. I have really enjoyed climbing with you. We'll make it. I don't think so. But we shall continue with style. Bad weather. Now or later, anytime for climbing.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, with support from Maxim Ropes.
And the fine folks at La Sportiva. And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enorma at checkout for a discount on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Kalous. It is May 24th, about 10:30 in the morning, and this is episode 176 of the Enormocast, a conversation with author, climber from the 80s, and current climber, Jeff Smoot. We had Jeff on my other podcast, The Runout, for a conversation about his book, and we waded through a whole bunch of technical difficulties to get that thing done, which is kind of interesting because I've always thought that doing these things face-to-face presented all these problems, mostly just logistical about getting the person in front of me. But doing remote interviews actually causes a lot of freaking problems too. So nothing's that easy to get these things done. Nevertheless, Jeff came to town a few weeks later, and I thought I'd go a little bit more in-depth with Jeff and talk to him about his book, Hangdog Days, which is a chronicle of some of the climbing in the 80s, especially the conversion people were going through from trad to sport and how that was kind of getting hammered out, particularly by two guys, Alan Watts up in Smith Rock and Todd Skinner all over the place, really. Todd was getting after it just about everywhere. So sort of a look at the era and also a bit of a profile to these two great climbers, one of whom, Todd Skinner, has passed away quite some time ago now. And talked to Jeff a little bit about his own climbing. He was there, he was chronicling it, but he was also involved. And it turns out he was a little ambivalent towards these new methods, being a bit of a traditionalist himself. But now we've got this book talking about the 80s, and I've probably mentioned it on here before, but I feel like the 80s were a lost era, at least recently. There's not been a lot of information, at least concise or big media, doing anything about the 80s. You know, the Valley Uprising just skipped it pretty much altogether. And with the whole Stone Masters kind of media juggernaut, it seems like that's all we ever talk about. But the 80s, you know, the 80s were important. And I think, in fact, the way most of us climb today, in terms of not only the fact that sport climbing is so popular, but also, you know, the idea of a red point, the idea of hangdogging, trying moves over and over again until you get them sorted out, and then trying to climb from the ground to the anchors. That kind of stuff is all really coming from the 80s, when they hashed out these methods for what we consider a fair ascent. And a lot of times the hashing out was fraught with conflict, which is a bit of what Jeff talks about in his book, Hangdog Days. So check out Hangdog Days. We talk about it in the episode that you can get it at Amazon, but you can also go to Mountaineers Books up in Seattle. You can go online to Mountaineers Books at mountaineersbooks.org and order it from there. Might be a little more expensive, but you know what? You're supporting an awesome publishing company that gets a lot of things into print that I don't think anybody else would touch. So support those guys, or go to Amazon, to Jeff Smoot's page, whatever you got to do to get this book in your hands. It's pretty awesome. When I did this interview, I actually hadn't read it yet. I'd read some excerpts. It happened to be out at that point just by a few days, but I didn't realize that before I did the interview. But, you know, I always laugh when I see, you know, Colbert or any of these folks like whipping books out night after night and kind of pretending like they read them, because there's just no way they have time to read all these policy books and everything else they talk about. They have a staff to inform them about the book. I'm in the middle of reading it now. I got it downloaded on my Kindle, and it's awesome. So highly recommend it. And that's about it for business for today before the interview, except that, once again, letting you know we will be up in Lander. So if you were thinking about going there, it's an awesome festival. I've been several years and always have a great time. Many legendary stories in my climbing life, and particularly in the Enormocast life, have come out of some days and nights up there in Lander. So going to be up there. Come check us out at the trade fair. We're going to have a table this year, which is the first time we weren't just standing around drinking at the trade fair. We're actually going to be sitting around drinking and selling some t-shirts and hats and giving away stickers and shooting the shit. Whatever we're going to do behind that table will remain to be seen. Apparently we do have to wear pants, so check out the details for the festival at climbersfestival.org. That's climbers with an S. It is really the flagship climbing festival of the year. Okay, folks, let's get to a conversation with author Jeff Smoot. But first, a word from our sponsor. Sportiva pretty much invented the downturned shoe with the introduction of the Testarossa ages ago. Too radical, cried the olds. That looks like it hurts, cried the fearful. Ooh, me likey, whispered a prepubescent Jonathan Segrist. And guess who went on to set the climbing world on fire in his testes? Hint, it wasn't Grandpa Flatfoot waving his hexes around and mumbling gear beta at a stump. And soon every company followed suit and steep climbs opened up to the masses. Now Sportiva took the venerable Testarossa and, under the direction of some of the best climbers in the world, did a redesign. The new Testarossa sports better heel hooking security and the famous P3 tech to help retain that downturned fit. So check out how the radical just got more radicaler at Sportiva.com or your favorite local shop. Sportiva is a proud sponsor of the Enormocast. So let's talk right into talking about your book, Hangdog Days. Let's talk about the germ for the idea of writing it, and then maybe we can get a little bit back into your participation in that era that you were writing about. Reading the parts of it that I have, I've always thought that a lot of eras have someone who is, they're like ubiquitous enough to observe a lot of what's going on, but also has that mind to kind of record maybe what's going on. And I feel like in this place and time, you seem to have been a little bit of that guy.
Yeah, it didn't occur to me while it was happening that I would ever write a book about it. I was interviewing climbers while I was traveling, taking pictures, hanging out. And, it wasn't until about 10 years later, I kind of dropped out of climbing in the late 80s, got married, had a kid, got a career. But late 90s, I got back into it in a big way and started, thinking back on everything that had happened. And I also started a website at the time and started blogging. So I was writing, it's like, I got to have content. Hey, let me write about Todd Skinner climbing City Park. And then, about Hugh Hare coming, a month later and repeating it. So I just started writing stories about what had happened with no intention of writing a book, really. But somewhere, early 2000s, I thought, hey, this could be a book. And I wasn't super serious about writing it. I didn't, go, write my chapters and pitch it to anybody because it just was like, no, I'm going to write the whole thing first because I really don't know. There's so much. So I just started writing the stories down that I remembered. And that it sort of progressed from there. So
let me ask you this. We're just going to go off in all these different directions, and hopefully I'll be able to bring it all back together. But you're talking about having a family, a career, and then getting back into climbing. What brought you back to climbing?
Oh, I couldn't stay away forever.
Right.
I mean, a lot of climbers, I've heard there's sort of a rule of thumb that people are really into it for a decade, and then a lot of them grow up, as they say, and realize that they have to make some money and they want to do something other than climbing with their lives. And I kind of dropped out, and I don't know if I met somebody first and then decided to drop out. I think I was becoming a little bit disillusioned with the way the sport was going. And, I can't remember exactly what my beef was, but I just thought, there's no future in this for me. I'm not going the way it's going. So I just thought, I'm going to go have a real life now. But that lasted, 7 to 10 years. And then it was just like, I got to get climbing again. I don't remember what the impetus was that drew me back. I think I just got really bored.
Yeah. I just had Mark Twight on, and, he did a serious type of climbing, that was all encompassing into his psyche, as it were. But he talked about being once a climber, always a climber. Even though he's not climbing anymore, he sort of says he looks at life like a climber, and thinks about things like a climber. And and I think the boredom, he's never had that problem because he did so many other weird, adventurous things. But yeah, life is just kind of has a little less spark without it, I think, sometimes. So let me ask you a little bit about your process then, because you did during this time and once you were climbing again, also incorporate writing into your life. Was that something that you had done your whole life, and as you started to incorporate it as a regular thing, how did you do that? What did that look like? Because I think a lot of people, the daunting task of finding time to write can be really an inhibitor to sort of their literary dreams.
Oh, definitely, especially when you have a career and a family. Finding time to write is sometimes impossible. So, going all the way back, I had, I had these dreams of being a freelance writer back in the 80s. And, I ended up I'm writing for climbing magazines. I was trying really hard to get a feature in Outside Magazine, and they weren't going for it. But I was writing news features and reviews and, doing all the freelance writer stuff that everybody has to suffer through. But But yeah, eventually I realized I wasn't going to make any money at that. It was really hard. I felt like I was kind of whoring myself out, because it's like, oh, I got to write an article. What should I write about? Oh, let me do a 10 best list. That's awesome because everybody loves those.
Right.
But it's like, I don't want to write. That's not writing. That's just, it's writing, but I don't want to demean people who do that for a living. But, I used to be one of those, and it wasn't a very good living. So, I became a lawyer eventually, but that career doesn't allow a lot of time for focusing on writing. So, I had sessions where I'd be up till 3 a.m. writing, and then I'd go to bed for a couple hours, and then I'd go to work.
Right.
And I'd be really tired the next day.
Yeah.
And so, it would go in spurts. I'd get like really into it, and I just couldn't stop writing. And then I would not write again for a couple weeks until I got really into it again, because it was so hard to find the time and the psychic energy to really focus and do a good job. Although now I've learned that when you're writing, you really shouldn't try to do a good job the first time. Just get the words down on paper, and then you and your editors can make it pretty. Yeah.
So let's keep the story going on that. Like you're this guy getting these stories out of your head and onto paper in the wee hours of the night or wherever you can grab some time. So yeah, let's continue the story of the genesis of then the book and how these editors got involved and taught you a few things about what you were doing.
Yeah, so finally a couple years ago, I got the courage to pitch the book, and I went to the Mountaineers books because I hadn't worked with them before. I'd worked with Falcon before.
Right, because you're actually a guidebook author.
Right.
Yeah, and I didn't know that until I looked up your Amazon page, because it's primarily Northwest guidebooks, so I hadn't necessarily seen your name on anything myself.
Right, it is, and so I'd always worked with Falcon with guidebooks, and I thought, well, this isn't a guidebook. Maybe I want to see if I can work with somebody else. And Mountaineers Books was close by. I mean, it's a 10-minute drive from my house to their offices. So I actually walked into their office and met with Kate Rogers, the editor-in-chief there, and sat down with her and pitched the idea. And she said, that sounds good. I said, I got a manuscript. It's 230,000 words long. And she's like, whoa, nope, we can't do that. It's going to have to be like 110,000 words. Because
okay, cool. I'm glad you said that, because I have no context about how many words as in like a 200-page book or what. So.
Right. No, this book came out at almost 300 pages, and I think it's about 115,000 words.
Okay. So you had a 600-page tome about climbing the 80s originally.
That's what I had, and that was it was too long. I kind of joke about it, saying I wrote Gone with the Wind, the Gone with the Wind of the sport climbing era,
right? Which
was just too long.
Yeah, clearly.
So she said it's got to be cut down and cut it in half, and then submit it, and then we'll see what we got. So it was very painful.
Yeah, I was going to say, was it discouraging?
It was, because as I referred to it, it's like going and killing your babies. These are your precious things that you've worked for hours and years writing, and then they say you got to cut these out. And so I just had to go out and say, okay, well, I'm going to cut out things and mostly I cut out things that were personal versus things about other people, because it wasn't really a story about me. So right. I left a lot about me out of the book and focused more on the other characters, which are more interesting than me anyway.
Right. And it kind of ends up being, the principal characters, as I understand it, are Alan Watts and Todd Skinner.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And was that also maybe a decision in terms of focus?
Yeah, it was. They assigned a developmental editor for me, and I worked with her for a few months going through, and she would read the manuscript and suggest cuts.
Right.
And then I would go back and either accept those cuts or argue with her about, things that I thought, no, this is important. Right. You don't understand the relevance of this to the whole story.
What was the ratio, you reckon, between okay and no, wait a second?
I mostly accepted what she said.
Okay, good.
Or I maybe rewrote stuff so that she would understand it better. But there were a couple chapters that I was like, this is really important to the story, I think. And so I think this needs to stay in. But by doing that, I had to sacrifice something else, because of the almighty word count. So that was it was hard to make choices, but we eventually decided with a 230,000 word sweeping saga. What you had to really find the thread and the focus of the story, and then work from that. And so we had a talk on the phone for a little while, and finally decided that partly it was going to be a tribute to Todd Skinner, and that it was a kind of a tribute to the era,
right?
And that's what should be focused on. So that made it easier to cut things that didn't really connect with that thread.
I kind of wanted to go back to something you said earlier with the original idea came out of this story of City Park, which, when you tell me that, I have a context for that. But let's put it into context for folks who don't have this perspective on what that was all about. The story of City Park and Todd's attempts on that, and Hughes coming and doing it as well. Can you kind of lay that story out a little bit for us?
Yeah, I can. So City Park is a nice, easy aid crack at Index Town Walls in Washington, and it's my hometown, Craig, basically. And it's a crack you can put nuts in all day and aid climb at C1, and it's everybody's practice aid crack. That's where they learn how to aid climb. It seemed like it could be a free climb, but it would just be like super steep pin scars, really shallow pin scars, pinky and like first knuckle kind of pin scars for 90 feet. Mm-hmm. And when we were down in Yosemite and Todd Skinner was working on trying to free climb the Stigma, well, after he did what he did there, I said, hey, you should come up to Washington and try City Park, because it's just like this. It's longer. And it might be harder, and you're looking for that, super hard route, the leap into the future. So come up and give that a try. And he did. And in 1986, he spent, a couple weeks up there working on this route to free climb it. And, he did his usual hangdogging and whatever routine on it. And I think some of the locals were not happy with what he was doing. So one day during a rain day, somebody smeared grease on the crack to thwart his attempts. And so he was, he went up and found it, got upset, thought they'd totally ruined his chances of climbing this thing. But then he went and got his butane torch out of his van, because everybody carries a butane torch when they're on a climbing trip, right? And rappelled down and burned the grease out. And then was able to send it, although he missed a spot of grease that was crucial to finishing the final 511 crack. So he had to do a slight detour at the variation at the end. But, that was just like one of those kind of, at the time we were outraged. It was outrageous that somebody would, try to sabotage Todd's attempt to free climb this crack in that way. But, as we reflected on it, it seemed kind of hilarious years later. Like, we found the humor in it, and it made for a better story than just Todd came and climbed the route.
Totally. Yeah. What was the one, maybe this is apocryphal as well, but there was always a story about him having somebody send him postcards about how dry a pitch was somewhere. Is that a true story?
So the story was that he went up there, I think in late 1985, to check it out. He went up when nobody knew he was up there to go see what it was about, and he found that it was wet. It was seeping water, and so he didn't want to waste his time driving up there again if it was going to be wet. So he found a kid in town who he paid to go out and look at the crack every once in a while and report back whether it was wet or dry. And the way he reported was he put a note on the bulletin board at the Index General Store. And so if the crack was wet, there was a note that said wet. And if he went out and it was dry, he'd change the note and it would say dry. And then Todd would occasionally call the Index General Store and ask the owner to go out and look at the bulletin board and read the note to him. And so he did that. And one day he called and the owner said, it says dry. So Todd raced up from Pinedale thinking he was going to get on it, and found out the crack was still seeping water. So he wasted a whole whole drive from Pinedale to go out and find out it was still wet at Index.
Yeah, I'm sure that kid was just looking at it and not a climber probably, or knowing what exactly he was looking at.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So that speaks of a few things. First of all, I was never sure if that was a true story. Knowing Todd's kind of penchant for the tale, for telling of the tale, along with Largo, that school of tall tale telling and adding a few things or not. I think would you agree that was kind of his vibe?
Oh yeah. I mean, there was always a grain of truth in the stories. It was based on something, but there was some stuff that was it was great storytelling, but you didn't know if it was true. And if you heard the story often enough, you realized it changed every time Todd told the story. So it was like the core of the story was true, right, but there were embellishments all along the way.
And which part did Hugh play in this?
So Hugh had come up to Index with Russ Clune and Bob Yoho in 1986 while Todd was working on City Park. And, Todd let everybody get on it and give it a try. And Hugh had even gotten on it to give it a try. But Index granite didn't work real well for Hugh's prosthetic climbing feet because it wasn't like, horizontal edges that you could toe in on. Vertical cracks with smears and crystals didn't really work it wasn't gunk style climbing that Hugh was good at. So, but Hugh made plans to come out later in the summer and wanted to give City Park a try after he found out Todd had done it. So he flew out and, I took him out there and he ended up repeating the route, over, 2 days of effort with very few attempts. But, he designed these prosthetic feet specifically for that route. They were these, I called them hatchet feet because they were shaped like a hatchet head, made of acetal wedges and with rubber on them, so they could be stuck in the crack, like kicking your foot right in the crack and then torquing, and he could stand up on those things. Right. And so, he kind of admitted that was cheating. But his response was, "Hey, I'm a cripple." Right.
Yeah. I actually had Hugh on the show and recounted that kind of game he would play with his prosthetics and how people would give him hell about it. But yeah, his response was like, whatever, I'm missing my legs. Like, give me a break. Right. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Cause I remember, those feet that he made for that are pictured, all over the place. Those very specialized feet that he made for that. Yeah. And I think that was also, a germ for what he was doing with, realizing that he could change. He could change the way his legs worked in a way that other people couldn't.
Right. And that was just at the time that, he was just before he was going into MIT, and he had come out to Seattle to meet with the director of the Seattle Prosthetics Research Study. Right. And so I got to go with him to up to Swedish Medical Center and visit with Dr. Burgess. And sit there while they drew on the whiteboard these ideas for prosthetic feet for athletes. Right. And so I think is really when Hugh really got started and really got serious about how to design prosthetic feet and limbs that could allow people to be equals on the playing field.
Well, yeah, he'll even go as far as to say better now.
Right. Yes, he will.
Yeah, for sure. So, well, that's cool. And I started this talking about, how an era has this person who's chronicling these things. And it just sounds like, we're lucky that you wrote this book because it seems like you were there, I was there. He was there and we went to this prosthetic thing together. It reminds me of, Dean Fidelman was on the show last summer. And he was like that guy for the Stone Masters, was there just all the time, was into taking photos. And, now we have this like priceless collection of pictures from that era. And so what was your deal with photography? Was that a part of something that you were into at all within the era?
Yeah, I was into it. I wasn't a great technical photographer, but I seemed to be the only person who always had their camera ready. Right. For whatever would happen. It was loaded and it was ready. And, I took the time to pre-focus on places where, if a climber happened to go, I didn't have to mess around with focusing. I could just click, point, and shoot to get shots. And, but yeah, so there's no good pictures of me climbing. Yeah. But I have lots of great pictures of everybody else.
Right. That's awesome. So again, it seems like you were sort of primed for this. Luckily, you had some interest in writing as well. But let's talk a little bit about how that came about, right? You were also your own climber. So you just said you didn't get any of the focus because you were the one doing it. But so how did your interest in climbing kind of start, maybe briefly, and then more interestingly, like falling in with this school, which was actually a sort of, and I say school because we're talking about, these people who are willing to preview routes on rappel and hangdog and sometimes place gear on rappel, things like that. These were kind of the rebels of the era. How did you end up being the guy that was hanging around with them versus what most everybody else was doing?
Yeah, Marcia Volk at smithrock.com put it a really good way. She said I was hanging with the hangdoggers.
Right.
And how did that happen?
Right.
I started climbing in the mid 1970s, and back in the day, like everybody else, I found a copy of Annapurna at the junior high library and read that and thought, wow, climbing sounds really cool. And then all the old National Geographic magazines, the climbing Half Dome the Hard Way, Americans on Everest, all that stuff. I just ate that up. And so I got interested in climbing, and I started finding, I found a rope in the basement, just like, everybody does. And then they go climb the trees. And my parents caught me rappelling out the bedroom window once and thought, oh my God, what are we going to do with this guy? So
probably in like a Dulfer sit style, like wrapped around your body.
It was something like that.
Yeah, right.
I don't think it was good technique, but I made it down.
Well, one quick thing is interesting always with this, especially with Annapurna, let's say, and the finding of the book is really, you're right. It's like, I talked to so many climbers of the era, the pre-internet era, and that's what happened. But it's funny that a kid, a junior high kid would read Annapurna and think that's awesome, because the amount of suffering that goes on in that book is like over the top, and it's funny that it takes a certain kid to think that's cool. Like, I want to go out and suffer, Right. And like, that sounds really neat. And it's kind of, you know what I mean? It's like, I just want to interject there. Like, I've heard this story so many times, but so many people would have been like, that's appalling. And it sounds terrible and scary.
Right.
Yeah.
But part of the attraction was it was appalling and it was scary to almost everyone.
Right.
So it was kind of this thing that, other people didn't climb. Climbing was hard. It was, dangerous. It was suffering. And, I bought my first rack off a kid in junior high school who had tried climbing and said he didn't like it.
Right.
It was hard, and he didn't like doing it. So, I scored my first rack for $20.
Yeah. And it was a real counterculture at that point too. So, you had to have somebody that was sort of seeking the out of the ordinary or off the path.
Right. It was a lot different than the modern culture where you take your 3-year-old to the climbing gym and they grow up in the culture. Nobody I knew climbed.
Right.
I had to seek it out. I had to discover it for myself.
Right.
And I had to want to do it. I had to be really internally motivated to want to do this thing.
So what did that look like? You got your rack of hexes now, and what how are you getting out?
Well, until I got my driver's license, I really couldn't do very much. So I took a course, and they took us volcano climbing, Pacific Northwest. So we got to slog up the volcanoes. And I hated that. I found out mountaineering was not the kind of thing I wanted to do.
Annapurna had led you astray.
It had led me astray. But one day we got rained off, and so the class went over to Leavenworth in the sun and did some easy granite climbing. And I thought, this is great. This is what I want to do for sure, because you don't have to hike very far to get to the rocks. And it's sunny, and
frostbite's very unlikely.
Very unlikely. You don't have to vomit because of the altitude. Right. You don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, I have to poop and everybody's going to see me out here on the glacier,
right,
kind of thing. It's just like,
just mortifying for a junior high kid.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, then you get your license and the world is your oyster, or what?
Yep. Yeah. I started going out to Index every weekend. Mm-hmm. And I started going out by myself and doing these stupid rope solos because that's, I didn't have a climbing partner. The same old story. I didn't have a climbing partner, so I went and soloed. But I met climbers at Index and started climbing with them, other kids my age. And so we went and had our misadventures.
Right.
And, but it wasn't until the early 80s that I started traveling. So, I was kind of motivated by Mark Hudon's articles, Long, Hard, and Free, and Astroman especially. I just really got a kick out of reading those and seeing the pictures of, climbers climbing these ungodly hard routes, rated 512. And so, I really modeled what I was doing after them and really wanted to get down to California. Mm-hmm. And so in 82, I took my first road trip and went to Joshua Tree.
Have you been paying attention to Mark lately?
To Mark?
Yeah, Hudon.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, he's kicking ass. He's making us old people look bad.
Yeah,
I
he's fully like climbing way harder than he ever has in his entire life.
Right.
Yeah, it's totally awesome. I just saw him in Moab. So yeah, he's on a road trip with this young kid, Jordan Cannon, that's just like putting him through the paces.
Well, it's great. And Mark told me while I was working on the book, and I was talking with him a lot, and he told me he wants to do Freerider.
Yeah,
so I think he's got a good shot right now. He's in really good shape. And I talked to Max Jones also, and Max said, "Yeah, Mark wants me to go climb Freerider with him, and that sounds neat, but I'd have to be a real climber again to do that. And that's a lot of work."
Yeah, and that's what Mark's doing, is he's reverted back to this super hardcore guy. And I mean, yeah, he's on his way. So we'll see how he does.
Don't call Mark super hardcore. Call him badass.
Yeah,
because that's what Mark says to himself to motivate himself to climb hard.
Right
you can do this, Mark. You're badass.
Yeah, he is. He's been doing great. Total aside, but yeah, it's like he's definitely the banner holder for older climbers right now. Being 63, I think he is.
Yeah, so. Well, he's inspiring me again. I'm starting to train harder, and I got to get back out, get down and do Astroman.
Nice. All right, so tangentializing as we do here on the Enormocast, you meet up with these guys in the 80s, then, and happens to be, I guess there's sort of this lost era, in my opinion, for whatever reason. We've got so much Stonemaster lore. Which is, it's always been there, but there's definitely been a little bit of a PR push of the last decade, the resurgence of this Stonemaster stuff. It kind of peters out literally in the end of the 70s. A lot of these guys go their separate ways, move on, like you said. That's what Mark did even in 1980 for a while. And then, there's these kind of splintered groups, I think, is part of the reason that maybe it's not this cogent era we can talk about. But there you arrive in this place where, free climbing is being defined, and there's different camps of old guard, new guard. So talk a little bit about that. And again, how you ended up falling in with one or the other, having revered these guys of your youth. And then, you end up hanging out with the counterculture guys that are pushing new things.
Yeah, when I think back on it, I kind of wonder how that happened, because I'm still kind of a staunch traditionalist. I don't really enjoy working routes. I'd rather Peter Croft is more of my hero than Todd Skinner or Alan Watts, just because he just let's go climbing.
Right.
And we're not gonna, I'm not hangdogging, and I don't place bolts on rappel. I just, find routes that are hard, and I on-site them or I solo them,
Right.
And that's great, So I kind of aspired to that. But I met Todd first in 1983 in Joshua Tree, and he was climbing with Paul Piana at the time, but Paul had to leave early, so Todd kind of latched onto me, and we did, me and everybody else that he could latch onto. Because Todd had that magnetic personality, and he was very inclusive. So, if you showed interest and could climb well, he was happy to have you along to belay for sure, but also to climb things. And so I started climbing with him, and he wasn't really breaking the rules too much in 83. He hadn't really embarked on that portion of his quest at that point. But he was just a lot of fun to hang around with. He told great stories. Just kind of lived this Spartan existence out of his van. And so that really appealed to me. So I got 3 weeks in Joshua Tree with Todd. And I lured him up to Washington to try a route, an unclimbed crack in Leavenworth, and told him, oh yeah, to be Washington's first 513 for sure, which really appealed to him. He's like, oh yeah, I want to do these hard routes that will have some sort of legacy. So he came up and he did it, rated at 512D, but it wasn't repeated for 25 years. And the guy who repeated it is a notorious sandbagger, and he said it's 513A.
Okay.
So we don't know how hard it really is, but definitely 513. So that kind of, solidified our friendship. And then he invited me to travel with him in 1985, saying, he needed a partner to go on his rash tour, as he called it. So I did, and I went on the road with him for the season. And that's when he was really embarking on his, his quest to expand the difficulty and the methods that were used to climb hard routes, which really went, he went against the grain of the establishment,
Sure,
for sure. And the thing about him was he was willing to do it right out in front of everybody. He wasn't climbing in secret like Ray Jardine had done in the 70s, where he'd go and establish all these super hard routes in Yosemite with his hangdogging and his friends that he had to keep secret from everybody. Todd would just go right out in front of everybody and do it. And even if he got flack for it, he'd be like, well, thanks, but I'm going to keep going. So that's kind of how I got into it. And so, I met Alan Watts along on that trip. And I don't know how I fell in with Alan Watts, honestly, because Alan was, a pretty hardcore climber that nobody really knew about at the time. He was very under the radar. I just started going down to Smith Rock more, and Alan was always there. He was there every day, and he was always climbing hard stuff. And, the other Smith Rock locals were always there too. And so I just kind of fell in with that group because they were always there every time I went. And Alan remembered me from, climbing with Todd. So somehow I got welcomed into that group and ended up, going on a road trip with Alan as well.
So can you illustrate a couple, or at least one of these stories where, these guys were openly thwarting or openly going against the grain, and sort of receiving some flack for it? Again, going back to this idea of some of these stories either getting blown up or some of them being apocryphal about the pushback that everybody got, whether it was fist fights or cut ropes, or, you hear all sorts of things. And they also get the whole 30 or 40 years of Yosemite climbing gets, you don't know what happened. But can you illustrate a story where those guys were, going against the grain and really pushing locals' buttons, maybe in Yosemite or something else?
Yeah, I think that where Todd mostly pushed the buttons in Yosemite was when he went to try to free climb the first pitch of the Stigma, right there on the Cookie Cliff. You couldn't really do that in secret, could you? Because it's right there on the crag that, John Backer walks by every day when he goes to free solo Crack-A-Go-Go or whatever up there. Yeah, Todd saw that crack. He'd heard a story, and, Largo says the story wasn't true at all, but Todd had heard the story that when Ron Fawcett and Pete Livesey had come over sometime in the 70s to climb, they wanted to go climb Butterballs, which at the time was one of the hardest free climbs in the valley. And so they really wanted to get on that. So some prankster locals took them over to the Cookie Cliff and said, here it is. And what they really turned them loose on was the first pitch of the Stigma, which, there's no chance that they could free climb that at all. And so the story goes that they worked on it, flailed, terribly. And then finally the joke was revealed and everybody had a good laugh. And then they went and climbed Butterballs. So that was the story that Todd either made up or remembered. I don't know which, but that got him thinking, like, I wonder if that could go. If it was the kind of crack that could fool a couple of Brits into at least trying it, maybe it would be a hard free climb. And so I'm going to go check it out. So he went and checked it out and decided that it could be pretty hard. But he thought that it was too thin. It was just a pin scar crack, but he thought it was too thin in places that he couldn't hang on to place gear. So he, bashed pins in every 4 feet for protection, which was a big no-no. With the ground up ethic, you got to start at the ground and place all your gear on lead. And then he top roped it to death, and then he started leading it and hangdogging all over it. And it was kind of under the radar, I think. Like some of the locals didn't really know about it until I opened my big mouth and told Charles Cole one day, Charles, I was making friends with some of the valley climbers, and I met Charles in Camp 4, and he asked, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I just came back from the Cookie Cliff. Skinner's over there, like, hangdogging on the stigma. And it's like, what? And it's like, yeah, he placed pitons in it for protection. And Cole got really mad. It's like, what? That's bullshit. And so he walked into Camp 4, with the smoke coming out of his ears, proverbially. And the next thing you know, John Backer shows up at the Cookie Cliff to give Todd a lecture about, what we do and don't do in Yosemite. Mm-hmm. And the way Todd recounted that story was really funny. He's just, it's like, and then John Backer told me that, son, we don't do that sort of thing around here. And I said, well, thank you very much, Mr. Backer. I'll keep that in mind. I'll take that into consideration. And then he goes right back to doing what he was doing. So, Todd got a negative reaction to what he did. And after he finished the route, he had the nerve to say, if anything in Yosemite is 514, this is it, which to me was just like, thumbing your nose at the guys, know. And, so, he left his pitons in place, and he left his note at the base of the route saying, hey, I'd appreciate it if you leave these pins in so other people can try the route. And, as if that was going to happen, they were gone the next day.
Right.
So that was one example. Alan didn't really go into, I don't think Alan went anywhere to do anything that provoked people. Mm-hmm. He had a kind of sarcastic side. He was very funny and very sharp-witted. And he could just say some really cutting things that, if you were the object of what he was saying, you might not appreciate it.
Sure.
So we went on that trip and went down, and he did, crack of the 80s on his second try, which climbers have been trying for over a decade to free climb this crack. And he did it on his second try. And then he went into Camp 4 and he bragged about it to Kurt Smith. And it was one of Kurt's projects. Kurt really wanted to do that, but he wanted to do it in good style. So there was no hangdogging, and Alan had hangdogged once, before he sent it on his second try. But Alan went in and, told Kurt, oh yeah, I did it. And Kurt got really mad. And I thought, for a second there that Kurt, might punch him or something, because it was just like the anger just rose in him for a second there. I mean, but Alan wouldn't have gone into Yosemite and, placed bolts.
Right.
Or, done something really blatantly against their moors. But, he had Smith Rock, and he didn't have people telling him how to climb there. So he, developed sport climbing there basically in isolation without anybody really knowing what was going on.
Well, I had a question reading another part of the book. I think you guys are in Joshua Tree, and I think it was in Josh, but there's a bunch of European climbers and British climbers hanging around as well. And is that where you guys were? Is the one about the wanker?
Yeah, where Jeff Wigan called us all wankers. Yeah. Right.
Because there was this image, and I think it continues to today, actually. It sort of ebbs and flows, that the Europeans were better climbers than the Americans. And obviously, I think Alan, at least in terms of wrap bolting, things like that, was he influenced by the European scene, or did he kind of like create this ethic in isolation, and it just turned out to be like kind of hand in hand with what was going on in Europe?
From what he says, initially he developed this basically on his own.
Right.
He had climbed all of the crack routes at Smith Rock that could be climbed, basically, and there was nowhere to go except to the faces. And everybody knew that to go to the faces meant you had to place bolts on rappel, because you couldn't lead on that rock.
Right.
That rock was terrible. So Alan did that. And so on Watts Tots in 83, he rappelled down and placed all the bolts on rappel. And so that's regarded as the first modern sport climb. But, that was what had to be done. And so that's what Alan did. And he didn't really get any opposition, great opposition to that. And, with the success of the first one, he went on and did chain reaction right after that, and, just kept going.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's also the nature of the rock up there. It seems like it's always been perfectly clean because it's all been climbed so much, but, he had to clean as well in terms of, setting up a hard route. Part of the rappelling was also to flick off the chunks here and there that were going to fall off in your hands. Isn't that right?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you tried to lead one of those faces in its original condition from the ground up, you'd have been popping off a flake with every move.
Right.
You'd have fallen off every move because you'd grab a little flake and it would pop off on you.
Sure.
So he had to go up and basically pre-pop the flakes off that you would pull off with your hands. And, so it wasn't like really a chisel job. You could take a screwdriver and just put it behind the loose part of the flake and pop it off. And that left some really nice edges, and so that was kind of manufacturing holds, but the nature of the rock kind of dictated that you do that, because otherwise you'd just be, have a miserable experience, as Alan put it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because it seems appropriate that these methods would again kind of create themselves based on the same conditions in two different places, because the exact same thing is what happened in France when they first created wrap bolting, is that we have all this limestone, we have blank faces, there's no gear. And in fact, on limestone, having climbed a lot of it in Canada, like where the fissures and the breaks are to put gear in is usually the worst rock. It's like falling apart in your hands. So
right.
Your traditional limestone route is oftentimes not that awesome, and then you're looking left and right to these beautiful hole covered faces, but limestone needs to be clean as well. So it's just interesting that these two separate movements appear to be the same because the conditions were the same. We have blank faces and we need to clean them first.
Right.
Yeah.
And those blank faces, existed in a lot of different places, but it was just, I think at Smith Rock, Alan lived close by and it was available and he was motivated. So it was kind of the right intersection of several factors that led to Alan doing that. I know that he became very influenced by the Europeans after a while, after he started reading about what they were doing and, going to Europe and seeing what they were doing. And then, and that to him, that justified, that validated what he had been doing.
Right.
He felt, I've been doing this the right way.
Right.
And other people have been doing it the wrong way.
Yeah. And in places like Boulder in the same era, folks like Christian Griffith, and they were specifically had gone to Europe and came back and said, this is how they're doing it over there. We're going to do that here in Eldo.
Right.
And, I think also it feels like to me, and you can maybe back this up or not, but there had been climbing a long time in Smith, but it didn't have, this like storied past and storied tradition the way Yosemite did and then the way Boulder had. And so I think like there's Alan up there and, there just really isn't like a group of people to oppose him, so to speak. You know what I mean? And meanwhile, Christian Griffith, that's where some really heated, almost to violence kind of debates went down over that when Christian was sort of the Todd Skinner, the Alan Watts of sport climbing in Boulder.
Right.
And,
I think the Boulder ethic was similar to the Southern California ethic, all that, Jim Erickson, Dave Brashears, and just the on-site leading, doing the dance with the rock and encountering the rock as your, not your partner, not your opponent, kind of in the dance. And people like Christian and Bob Horan and others just thought that's the old way. But if we're gonna climb new routes, we're going to have to adopt the new methods. And if we're going to climb hard and compete with the Europeans on our soil, we're going to have to do these things differently.
So someone like Backer, or in that camp, they have an argument that would probably go like, well, first of all, competing with the Europeans doesn't matter to us. Climbing harder if we're gonna use these methods, why not wait until our methods are good enough? Leave it for a future generation. When you were involved in this, like having sort of the headspace of these traditionalists and hanging out with these guys, did you have any opinion or in the end, like privately find what those guys were doing maybe to be a bit of a sort of blasphemy or sacrilege against the tradition, or were you just kind of ambivalent one way or the other?
Oh no, I definitely had an opinion about it.
Okay.
I didn't think, at Smith Rock, I didn't think badly of what Alan did.
Right.
Because it was Smith Rock.
Yeah.
And, that's the tradition that grew organically there.
Yeah, I think like Alan, like when I was talking about an older tradition, it's almost like Alan created the first tradition in a way. I don't know, or maybe not.
No, the Smith Rock had a loose tradition of, ground up and red pointing. Mm-hmm. And so Alan broke that tradition with the rappel bolting, and he didn't always red point the first ascents of his hardest routes. Right. Some of them were yo-yoed, and some of them were with gear left in place. Right. But
anyway, back to your opinion.
Yeah. But I really respected Backer and Peter Croft's approach and attitude. I was kind of jumping on the Todd Skinner and Alan Watts bandwagon a little bit, especially with some of the stuff I was writing, defending them in print. I wasn't saying that rappel bolting was okay, but I just if they're hangdogging or pre-placing gear, that's not hurting anybody. Mm-hmm. If you don't like what they're doing, just do it in better style. Right. And say you did it in better style, and then you're the hero. You get the positive press, and you prove that you're right. But I had a definite, I was fairly anti-bolt at the time. I've never placed a bolt, and I've chopped a few, so I kind of took a high moral position with those sometimes. But I was really taken aback Peter Croft's reaction, because I really respected Peter, and his reaction was exactly what you said. We don't need to compete with the Europeans. We don't need to climb 514. Why don't, it's kind of like going back to John Solith, why can't we just climb? Right. Just find what you like to do and do it, and shut up.
So many other climbers, they do have at least I guess Peter's a big exception to this, but a competitive streak with each other, with, what's going on even locally or worldwide. The Europeans, at least the ones that came over here, you talked about Jeff Wiegand just saying that we can't climb because we're wankers. Like, there was an era, I think, in the end of the 80s, in particular, when sport climbing really got going, where that was, kind of like the attitude du jour of just like crankiness and kind of poking fun of at each other and even just like outright insulting other climbers about how well that they climbed. I mean, that was definitely his vibe anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
The conflict really kind of erupted with the magazines, the way they covered it. Mm-hmm. That, they were just making such a big deal about every new hard route that was done. And, people were getting their pictures on the cover and getting articles written about them and being interviewed for all basically a lot of spray. Right. And, the climbers who weren't adopting the new tactics, they were kind of getting left behind, because they couldn't do as many new routes, and they couldn't climb the harder routes, because they weren't adopting these tactics. And so, a lot of people just thought, I'm not going to, keep doing this the traditional way, because I'm just not going to be able to produce. And, sponsorship started happening. Right. And so, well, if you're sponsored, you got to do something so you get your name in the magazine. And so, people just started going, well, the fastest way to do that is to just, adopt the Euro tactics and put on some Lycra tights and get my picture on the cover of Climbing Magazine.
In the very beginning of the show, you mentioned not really remembering why you got a little disillusioned and started looking for some other things in your life, but kind of putting it in context of when you stopped climbing, at least for that time, it seems like a lot of this stuff was coming to a head, this hyper competitiveness, the competitiveness over sponsorship, the kind of real butting of heads around the country and anger over this stuff. Could that have been playing into your mindset, if you remember?
It could have been. Now that I think about it, I think that the moment that I remember where I thought, oh my God, what are we doing? Was after I wrote the article for Mountain Magazine about Smith Rock that came out in the winter of 1986, I think. Okay. And, Smith Rock, up till then, every time I'd visit it, there'd been practically nobody there. I mean, the first time I went there in 1983, I was the only person in the whole park all day. And then the next day I met a guy who just happened to drive up and to see if anybody was there. And I was there. So we climbed together. So the two of us had the whole park to ourselves all day. Right. And then on return trips, there'd be a handful of people in the park, Alan Watts and his friends, or I may have come with someone and we'd be climbing. But it was just, we had it to ourselves, and it was fun, and we could do whatever we wanted. And Alan was working away on his projects, but nobody was really coming to visit. I returned in 1985 with Kim Kerrigan and Jeff Wigand and Johnny Woodward, just for a day with those guys, and then I took off. But that was kind of the first incursion of the foreign climbers, a serious incursion where they realized what was going on. And after that visit, I wrote an article for Mountain Magazine, and just saying what a great place it is. It's like the one of the greatest climbing places in America that you've never heard of. And after the article came out, everybody heard about it. And that spring I went there instead of Joshua Tree, and the place was packed. It was just like so full, and climbers from all over the country and all over the world, and you couldn't get a parking space, and you had to wait in line on routes, and everybody was up there in their Lycra tights, and they were swearing every time they fell off. You'd hear the F-bomb and whatever else, some other really entertaining things that climbers say when they
sure.
And it's just like, oh my God, we've turned this great place into this like almost like Disneyland. And so I was like, wow,
single-handedly ruining.
I didn't.
Rock.
That's not what I had in mind.
Right.
I didn't intend to do this, but I saw like this is what's going to happen everywhere.
Right.
And I was like, whoa, I don't know if I really want to. I don't know if I want to do this anymore.
Well, don't go there this weekend then.
I'm not going this weekend.
Yeah, because things have changed a lot. That's interesting. The again, like what you just said about people in Lycra and falling and swearing, and because I always think of that as this real punk rock kind of era of climbing, where these guys that were like elbowing their way into this sport climbing thing, and I mean that that they were definitely being pushy and having to break the rules. And then I think that with guy that tended to sort of give them that attitude, like this fuck you attitude, because they kind of had to have it to get what they were getting done. And if you look at that era, it's like Huron Rifle, which was a little bit later, but was this big germ of like real sport climbing. It was a real angry kind of weird era when those guys were first in there doing all those hard routes.
Yeah. Look at me. I'm bad. Yeah. I'm a sport climber.
Yeah, totally. That was it.
And and that wasn't the vibe leading into that. Right. But it just like, I think 1986 is when I noticed it really erupted. Mm-hmm. And just, I didn't know there were so many climbers doing this.
Right.
I guess I'd been in relative isolation with, Alan at Smith Rock, and then traveling with Todd.
Well, it's interesting that, to me, it was this real kind of rough and tumble, pushy era, but it did all settle out into kind of creating the way that we climb today. The sport climbing not only survived, but it's the most, I think, practiced type of climbing in the world now by the most amount of people. Hangdogging is not even, it was a pejorative, that word, kind of funny, but also kind of, people would yell at each other as an insult. That's not even a consideration other than some real sort of dank disappearing places and out of the way places in the world. So, did you have an idea that this huge trend was being set, and maybe was it that realization that you maybe felt like the tide had turned?
Yeah, that's the moment I felt the tide had turned, really, because climbing as an adventure sport, I think, to me personally, it kind of died right there. I felt that it had changed. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the sport that I had grown up with. Something new had emerged, right. and ironically, I was part of making that happen, which is like, this is not what I intended to do. Right. What am I doing?
I have defiled the temple.
I know. So, it definitely, I can't say the change was for the worse. Clearly, climbing is super popular. People have done amazing things. I credit the sport climbing, the birth of climbing gyms, mm-hmm. The explosion of climbing gyms, really. Right. It's gotten so many people into climbing who would never have thought of going climbing, because it's such an inviting, embracing, place to go. And kids grow up in the climbing gyms now.
Yeah.
And, then they go outside for their first time and, on site of 513, which, we used to have to work our way up through the grades for years and years and years. And even then it was like 513 is really hard.
Yeah.
So, it's a totally different thing now, but, people continue to go back to, I love it that people are doing trad ascents of sport routes. I think that's great, especially when they don't work them. They try them on site on gear. That to me says that, that tradition hasn't died. It's just, still in the hands of a few.
Right.
The people who are willing to suffer and take risks are still out there, and they're still doing that.
Ultimately, what do you think your intent or your hope for this book's legacy to be as people pick up Hangdog Days and read that book? What do you hope they take away?
I think that I just intended it as a snapshot of the era from my perspective. Mm-hmm. What I saw, some of the characters I hung out with, so they can get a flavor of what it was like climbing during that time and how things changed and who was responsible for it. And I do hope that people who don't know what happened, who got the 70s and got the 90s, but didn't know what happened in the 80s, can read that and get a better understanding of how the sport evolved during that era. I think that's mostly what it was about.
Well, they can get it obviously at Amazon, but if you really, really care about mountaineering and climbing literature, you should go to the Mountaineers Books website and buy it there.
Yes, Mountaineers is a storied institution in the Northwest that has taught climbing and mountaineering for years, and it's a nonprofit.
Right.
So the profits to the Mountaineers go to support those programs.
Yeah, and there's not many other publishers that would have taken your 250,000 words and helped you that much to get it down to a proper book. So. That's what they're doing up there, is taking these projects and making them happen, where I think a lot of other publishers wouldn't touch it probably.
Yeah, I don't know if when they have a successful book that helps subsidize the other books, but
right.
they do put out a lot of books on a lot of different outdoor activities, rock climbing, mountaineering, hiking, mm-hmm. whatever, and they're just really helping get the word out to everybody.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for sitting down and stopping by the kitchen.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right, folks, thanks for listening, as usual. And thanks to Jeff Smoot for coming to town and coming to my house and getting this thing done. Once again, check out Jeff's book, Hangdog Days, Amazon, or better yet, mountaineersbooks.org, and get yourself a copy. Fill in this little gap in your climbing knowledge, especially a little younger, wondering how we got to this red pointing, bolt clipping paradigm that we're in now. Check it out. All right, remember that you can go to the Help Out tab at enormocast.com to help out the podcast by following the Facebook page, writing a review at iTunes. Actually, the Enormocast has so many reviews at iTunes. The Enormocast has almost 1,000 reviews, I think, and the large percentage of them are quite good, and I appreciate that. But it's pretty wild because I can look at podcasts that go out way further, way bigger audiences than the Enormocast that have way less reviews. I think the reviews do something good. They mostly make me feel good, although frankly I haven't looked at all of them because that's a lot of reviews to look at, and I kind of get embarrassed when people compliment me. I do actually literally filter out the few bad reviews and read those because that's, just the kind of person that I am. Anyway, you can also do some other stuff there. Join the Facebook page, but also tell your friends. I get emails a lot from people who say, I just found this thing. I've been binge listening, which I do not recommend, but if you got to, you got to. Anyway, so people are still finding the podcast, so help me out with that. And finally, if you feel like donating a little bit of money to the podcast, you can do that there as well. And no, I am not starving over here. The Enorma baby is not starving. But remember that this does take a bunch of work. A man should be paid for his work. I think. And the sponsorships do a part, but the donations do a big part as well. So if you feel like it has value and it's gotten you through some boring times or tough times or just some drives, then think about kicking a little bit of money down. That is all about that. Okay, folks, the weather in the western United States, and I think actually much of the United States and Canada, has not been conducive to climbing in the last couple weeks. Yosemite got washed out. Rifle, Colorado here on the western slope has been washed out. The Utah desert's been washed out. I know the Midwest, for what's climbing out there, has also been getting dumped on. So, I don't know, East Coast, you guys doing all right? What about the rest of the world? Anyhow, take it easy. I guess that's more time for some Enormocast. But when you do get back at it, of course, check your knot. And actually wear a helmet, too. It's time for helmets. I'm talking about helmets now. Helmets are cool. Let's make them cool. You know, people used to not wear helmets skiing very often, even like a decade ago. And now it just seems silly and stupid to not be skiing, at least on a resort, with a helmet on. And they're cool. So let's make climbing helmets cool. And if not cool, at least smart.
I have things that, if they let us bolt, will be 514B, and there's some chance even harder. And it's a matter of, we'll become strong enough to do them. We will have the commitment and the time and the weather. If we are allowed to bolt, then we'll have tremendous climbs for the Europeans and the rest of the Americans to come back to next year.
Now it ain't flat. The teachers told me that's where it's at.